have the one and only David Furlong. Okay, now ancient Egypt, what he doesn't know about, as the old-fashioned saying going, isn't worth knowing. It's a fantastic PowerPoint. And I was just saying to David at the church, I've known David's work with my late father since 1990, wasn't it? Where has that time gone? I call that BC, before children, before Avon. So she's my marker point. So without further ado, David is a prolific author. He has looked into ancient Egypt on many different levels, and he has such a font of wisdom. So I'm going to hand over straight away to David Furlong.
Thank you, Maria. I find it quite hard to sort of think I can, that I can live up to that wonderful introduction. But I have been around a long time, as you can see by my grey hairs, and I've been exploring into the weird and wonderful for a large chunk of my life, in a sense of just flagging up some of the things which have been of interest to me. I grew up in a family which believed in spiritual healing, so I got exposed at a tender age to the idea of the weird and the wonderful, that there is a whole other level of consciousness that we can begin to access. And that thread has run through my life really since. At the moment, well, over the last 20 years, I've been practicing as a regression therapist. So I've been exploring what's going on within the inner consciousness of individuals to try to bring a sense of healing and balance to them. And I want more about that before the end of my talk. But as far as ancient Egypt is concerned, I can remember when I was 14 or thereabouts, or even maybe a bit younger, reading a book about ancient Egypt. And there was something about a concept called Remember Akhenaten. And as soon as I read it, I sort of thought, something about this I remember. And so that lodged with me for a long period of time. And eventually I managed to get to go to visit Egypt in the 1980s. But it's an extraordinary culture, and it's something which has been imbued within me, which I want to share with you today. But not only that, I want to try at the end to build a bridge between ancient Egypt and what's going on here in this landscape here in Avebury, because we are in a very significant point in a whole pattern of energy which sits around Avebury, a whole set of sites and so forth. So there was a culture here which produced in the landscape something which I think is absolutely profound, and opens up to a whole other level of wisdom, and certainly connects back in symbolically, if not factually, with what's going on in ancient Egypt. This is a statue of Pharaoh Menkaure, who was the builder of the smallest of the three great pyramids on the Giza plateau. And I think it's just wonderful, the sense of connection. You see his wife stood next to him, the same height. So the sense of balance of male and female, and the tender way in which she has her arm around him, is in the sort of protective sense. And you can see from the statue, the left foot is forward, which is suggested indicates the connection to the heart and the heart energy, because the heart was absolutely significant within ancient Egypt. But as far as Egypt is concerned, it's sort of, the earliest bits go back to about 3100 BC. These are a few factual parts. It was claimed that it was unified by a pharaoh called Narmer Menes, and Egypt's always talked about the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. So the pharaoh was the ruler of the two lands, and this sense of polarity is I think something which is really significant. So around about 3100 BCE was the start of dynastic Egypt. this unification point. And so it wasn't until the death of Queen Cleopatra, when Cleopatra VII, when she was defeated by Augustus, someone who became Augustus Caesar or Octavian, that Egypt came fully under the dominance of the Roman Empire, and the sort of dynastic period came to an end. So there's 3,000 years. And if you think back in the history of this country, where were we 2,000 years ago? That about going back another 1,000 years again, of sort of clear understanding and knowledge and understanding which went through the whole of the culture. So Egypt was primarily, let's just go back on something, was primarily focused on the River Nile, which was called the Nile Valley. An extraordinary level of culture developed because of the Nile. The Nile was called Happy, and I think that's a really good name for happy. The Egyptians had a way of sort of embodying natural things with names, concepts, and an idea of a divinity. But to think of the sophistication which came out of came out of Egypt, and thinking that the habitable area of the Nile Valley was probably about the same size, of a third the size of Ireland. It's just extraordinary to think within that relatively small area of land, such a sophisticated culture came forward. Again, on a sort of practical level, this, how do we do this? Yes, this is the top, is one of the earliest palettes of King Narmer, unifying the land of Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is sometimes referred to as the archaic period in ancient Egypt. And it was divided into segments, really reached a very high level of understanding, knowledge, and then it went into a sort of period where they called the intermediate period, where it was a little bit chaotic before it emerged again. So all of the great pyramids were built in the period of the Old Kingdom, and it started off with this step pyramid here, designed by an architect called Imhotep. Again, just think the culture, the understanding. What was it that inspired an individual to begin to create pyramids and to think about all of that side from that perspective? And then we go from the pyramid age, which is the Old Kingdom. There was a collapse, as you can see, for a period of time, not too long, 50 years or so. And we come into another phase of Egypt called the Middle Kingdom, where again there was sometimes known as the Golden Age of Egypt. There was some amazing structures were created before we come into the next period called the New Kingdom. And the New Kingdom had some, again, this is where the Pharaoh Akhenaten came forward. This is Sesostris, who was a pharaoh from the Middle Kingdom. And it led to the building of fantastic temples, sites like this temple here of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el Bahari. But one of the things I want to do is to just saying that a little bit about the history of Egypt, is then to come on to begin to look at something of, to begin with, something of the culture, of the consciousness, of the understanding. And I want to begin by something which is quite interesting, isn't it? Because we are brought up on a modern myth, right? And it's based upon an assumption. And in this myth, it tells us that right at the beginning, there was something called the Big Bang. And that happened about 13.8 billion years ago. So something, however, physical matter started to be created. The universe started to be created. And then we go through a series of steps in this Big Bang to the start of galaxies, the start of stars, and the start of our own sun, about 4.6 billion years ago. And before we get to the birth of planet Earth and the planets in the solar system. And as we go through this cycle, we get to a point of about 4.28 billion years ago where life started to emerge on this planet. Now, the complexity of what brought life into existence is phenomenally large. And science has got no real explanation, except they know that because we exist, that life must have come from somewhere, and they can trace that back. But when you look at the amount of atoms that were needed to be brought together to create life, if you imagine a housing estate with all the bricks in the housing estate, you would need to build a housing estate to cover the whole of this country for life to begin to emerge. And all of those bits would be neatly be able to be put into place. So life, the emergence of life, is a phenomenal experience. And again, according to science, we go through various stages before eventually we end up about 300,000 years ago with something that they would regard as being conscious. And we can have the idea that our ancestors, from a scientific point of view, this is when consciousness began to emerge. But I like to present to you that that's an assumption. That is an assumption. The assumption is that physicality came first, whereas the ancient Egyptians had another whole perspective. From the ancient Egyptian perspective, consciousness first emerged out of what they called the waters of none. So, if you like, there was some primordial level before consciousness emerged. And consciousness emerged in the form of a god that they called Ra, Atum. And within this solar system, this was perceived as being the sun, as being the representation of consciousness. Now, if consciousness came first, it means that consciousness must be all around us. We must be living in a sea of consciousness. And every time you think of someone, immediately through your consciousness, you can connect to them. So I'd like you to almost begin to move out, and this is what they've been talking about here, the other two wonderful speakers this morning, is about understanding consciousness, understanding who we are. And I'd like you to really take on board that your consciousness is not just stuck in your head. The ancient Egyptians didn't care about the head. It was all to do with the heart. But I'd like you to think of your consciousness as expanding and to be potentially anywhere and everywhere. And that this room is filled with consciousness. Because in this story of Ra, in that sense, Ra goes on to create, Atum Ra goes on to create other levels of consciousness. And in the myth, he first of all creates two energies called Shu and Tefnut, represented by an individual with a feather, which is to do with consciousness. And you can see the idea of consciousness coming out through the crown chakra and the symbolism of there. But two energies, air and water. Air and water, very interesting, because the word feng shui from ancient China, and this is another thing to take on board, that if consciousness permeates everything, if these patterns permeate everything, then every culture is going to be picking up similar patterns, similar ideas. And feng shui means wind over water. Wind over water. What happens when wind blows across water? You get waves, don't you? And this is a wonderful symbol because it's the symbol of the unseen affecting the seen. We can feel the wind, but we can't see it. And in the same way, we can begin to feel the connection of consciousnesses, but we don't necessarily see them. And so part of our journey, if you like, is how we can begin to connect into and understand consciousness and these other levels of consciousness, which we can begin to work with and communicate with. So in this myth, Shu and Tefnut, they married, they produced, they had a relationship, and they produced two other gods and goddesses. A god called Geb, who was the god of the earth. Now, we tend to think of the earth as Gaia, and the earth is feminine. Not so in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, the earth was a male energy. And the sky goddess, Nut, was feminine. So again, it represents a really important principle to begin to take on board and think about, is that the way in which we understand polarities, how we tend to project onto things our perception of those polarities. And from my point of view, again, what was emphasized this morning was about balance, the need for balance. And this is something which was fundamental in ancient Egypt. We need to begin to understand how we balance and relate to energies. And I would much prefer us to think about, if you like, this creative energy and I grew up with this idea, so this is why it touches me so deeply, that this creative energy that brought everything into existence, that was there before the Big Bang occurred, was a male-female principle, a yin-yang principle. So I always like to have a sense that the creator is a father-mother creator, father-mother God, father-mother divinity. We need to hold that sense of that polarity. And the same applies to the earth. I absolutely understand why we tend to see the earth at this moment in time in the form of Gaia. We need to acknowledge Mother Earth, that mother divinity. But we also need to understand the balance of the polarities, because if we push it too much one way or the other, as all of the evidence supports, if you push something to an extreme in ancient China, it would always reverse into its opposite. So it's understanding balance. And what you find in ancient Egypt, you've got these beautiful scenes, and this is off of papyrus, where you see the sky goddess Nut and the earth god below, Geb. And the idea was they were all the time wanting to be in a sort of sexual relationship. And so Tefnut had to keep them apart. But it was all part of that myth, because out of the relationship of Nut and Geb, all of the other physical things came into being. But before physicality really emerged, there was a series of other gods which became created. Nut and Geb created 4 primary divinities. There was Nephthys, or Nebthet, Set, Osiris, and Isis. And this begins to introduce another important part that we need to take on board. One of these characters here, Set, embodied all of what you would understand as the shadow. So there was a real understanding of the significance of the shadow, the importance of acknowledging the shadow, and how we need to begin to balance and understand the shadow and the shadow energies. Because if we ignore the shadow, or we pretend it doesn't exist, or we reject it from ourselves, then it only gets carried by other people. So part of our journey, as well as trying to embody the light, is to understand and acknowledge our own shadow self, and to try to work with that from an energetic point of view, to begin to transform, if you like, some of this energy. So ultimately what we have was we ended up within what was called the Heliopolitan mythology, 8 primary principles, 8 gods and goddesses, if you like, of which Osiris was one, and Nephthys and Isis, and we've got Horus, Hathor, Anubis, and Thoth. So that represented an Ogdoad, an 8 group. And of course, in the mythology, there was the famous story of Osiris. He was a wise philosopher king. He went out, brought the benefits of civilization to humanity. He was a great teacher. And whilst he was away, his brother Set was left in charge of the kingdom of Egypt, and of course started to get jealous. So this is where the shadow side starts to come in. And in the myth, when Osiris came back, Set held a big banquet in his honor, and he had created a sarcophagus. And he said whoever would fit this sarcophagus, he would give the sarcophagus to that individual. Of course, Set was very clever. He had designed his sarcophagus to be exactly the same size as Osiris. So one by one, everyone tried to get into it, couldn't get into the sarcophagus. Then eventually Osiris got in, and as soon as he did, Set slammed down the lid and then threw the sarcophagus into the Nile. And then a little bit more of the story goes on. It ends up with Osiris being cut into 14 pieces. And it was Isis who then had to go on a journey to begin to bring these pieces back. Now, this is very interesting because it taps into something else, which was talked about this morning. It was about our ancestors. And if you think about your ancestors, you've got 2 parents, haven't you? You've got 4 grandparents, and you've got 8 great-grandparents. And if you add those numbers up, you get 14. So maybe part of the myth is, how do we begin to connect in to these ancestral patterns which are working through us to begin to reunite them? And in the myth, what happened is Isis was able to gather up these 14 pieces of Osiris, except the one piece which had got eaten, which was his penis, and that part had been devoured by the crab. But Isis, with her magic, bringing in a whole other level of creativity, was able to bring Osiris back to life, and in at the same time for herself become impregnated, and she gave birth to the god Horus. So something new was born. And in the Egyptian mythology, there is an eternal tussle which goes on between Horus and Set for the gaining of the rulership of the land. And ultimately, it was said that Horus came out on top. But in some ways, it's how we begin to balance these yin-yang energies inside of ourselves, and particularly things to do with the shadow. But unfortunately, around this planet at the moment, the shadow is quite strong. We can see it being manifested out in different situations which are going on, which are causing a lot of distress. So it's taking on board this sense of these archetypal energies. And part of the journey, the soul's journey, that as soon as an individual passed over, they were then collected by the god Anubis and taken on a journey before what was called the judgment scene. And from ancient Egypt's perspective, how you were judged upon was whether you were true of heart. So that was a really significant thing. And you have the sense of the scales there, where your heart was weighed against the feather of truth, whether you've been true of heart. And they had what they called the negative confessions. You had to say, I had not said bad things about my neighbor. I had not stolen any goods. I had not murdered anyone. And that negative confession was a way of trying to bring a sense of acknowledgement, to bring about a feeling that in order to be allowed to move through into the realms of the afterlife, that you had to go through what was called that negative confession. And you can see here, in a sense, Osiris sat on the throne. He chose, once he had been resurrected, he chose to rule from the other realm, the other dimension. So that principle is still there, but we need to access it. And behind him stood Isis and Nephthys support. And then you can see Horus, Thoth, Anubis as part of the retinue of the gods, which help conduct the souls into the other world. Part of my work at this moment in time is working with individuals who have entities or souls attached to them. And that can create problems for them. So part of what I try to do, and certainly in relationship to working in place, is to help stuck souls, spirits which are stuck, to be able to move back into the other dimension. And you can see also in this picture a lot of other symbolism. You can see these 14 assessors, which is the parts of Osiris, which were cut up and being connected again. That's important that the soul had to make acknowledgement of those 14 parts, as though acknowledging those 14 ancestors, the ancestral parts of who they are. But if we begin to also think about this idea of consciousness manifesting everywhere, then we can begin to take on board the thought that you're going to find representations of these patterns in other situations, in other scenarios. And I know this morning there was talk about the tarot. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of the tarot cards. But what I found it was interesting when I started to look at the tarot and the tarot deck is to recognize that those same principles you could see represented in the tarot, because there are 8 key character cards in the tarot, which I've shown represented here on this slide. And if you look at the major arcana in the tarot, it's all to do with an initiatory journey that in some senses we're all on. It expresses it beautifully, because in the card, there's two cards in the tarot which relate to us, the sun, and I note on Maria's phone that she has that sun card on her phone, and the other card is the tower, and the tower is sometimes referred to as La Maison Dieu, the house of God. Well, where is your house of God? It's your physical body. So the tower represents that descent into the physical. And in the symbolism of the tower, you see the crown being displaced, which means that when we come into incarnation, we often lose connection with that spiritual dimension. And the journey is, how do we re-crown ourselves? How do we reconnect with that spiritual level within us? And in order to do it, we need to begin to recognize that we have to, in this journey, we have to call upon the support of these spiritual energies which are around us. So we can think at this moment in time that there within this room, if you like, of the symbolism of the gods and goddesses, the energy of the gods and goddesses. And in our own way, we can begin to think about, how do we connect to these energies? How can we begin to acknowledge them? How can we begin to work them within our own individual sense of space and self within our being? And part of my early journey in relationship to exploring my inner world was learning to begin to communicate with and connect to these archetypal energies. And I found that the profound teachers really are coming forward. So you can find that level of support within yourself. Now, whether you do it in the context of ancient Egypt, the symbolism, or whether through ancient China, through the symbolism of the I Ching, or through any of these other traditions, and I'm sure in the Mayan culture it would have been exactly the same concepts, that there are these patterns of energy, patterns of consciousness that we can call upon to assist us in our journey through life. I mean, in Christian terms, we often talk about calling on the Archangel Michael or the Archangel Raphael. It's all the same principles. In ancient Egypt, from my perspective, I would see the goddess Hathor as being the same as the Archangel Michael. And if any of you know anything about the goddess Hathor, great healing goddess, a goddess of joy, a goddess of nourishment. But she also had another form of the goddess Sekhmet, which was the lioness. So there was a fierce side to Hathor, but very strong. So it's how we begin to work with these energies. And again, just as a reflection across, looking at the I Ching and the symbolism of the I Ching, we again see this yin-yang symbol, how it's based upon two principles, yang and yin, yang outgoing, yin receptive. And how they developed this pattern by saying, first of all, let's bring two yang lines together, or a yang line over a yin line. So this is the first stage, before that they then brought three lines together. And you find when you bring three lines together, you get 8 patterns. And those 8 patterns formed the basis of the very famous oracle in ancient China called the I Ching. I believe that it was Confucius who once said, if I had the rest of my life again, I would devote it all to studying the I Ching, because it's that relationship to these higher spiritual realms which is important. So that sort of begins to set a scene, but I want to just now come on to talk about something else to do with ancient Egypt. And this is all to do with the area of alignments. As I've said to you, I first went to Egypt in, I think, about 1982, 83. I was blown away, if you like, particularly by some of the experiences I had then, particularly in the temple of the goddess Hathor at a place called Dendra. Just an amazing place, phenomenal energy. But in my studies, I've been also interested in earth energy alignments and so forth, which I also will just come on to later. And I started to think about all the alignments to do with what might be going on in ancient Egypt. And at the time, I think Google Earth has started to come out with its program. And I was able to load that onto the computer. And again, from my point of view, I know some people have a problem about computers, but sometimes when I turn my computer on in the morning, I bow down in front of it and think, amazing computer, you know, what it's able to achieve, what it's able to produce. Because when I started off in all of my research work, I was working with slide rules and you know, calculating tables and so forth. And then along came some pocket calculator. I think, wow, this is amazing. I can start to do, you know, calculations. Because when you want to try and check things out, you need to know precisely where does the lines go. If you're trying to plot alignments across maps, you need to know the grid coordinates so you can begin to plot the lines accurately. So the development of the computer, the development of Google Earth have been amazing. And here on the right, it's not a very good slide, but you can see Google Earth, and over it, I've started to put some alignments because I started to look at and think about, I wonder why the temples in Egypt were aligned in the way they were. Standing there, you see this wonderful alignment going right through. I think, you know, is this just coincidence? Is this chance? And then, of course, I discovered, and there was no discovery of this, well, say I qualify it slightly, very little reference to this at all in Egypt, that this is aligned to the midwinter sunrise. The midwinter sunrise. And I started to plot out and look at how sunrise patterns started to work through this temple. Now, this is the temple on the left here is a great temple of Karnak, amazing temple complex. Started probably in the Middle Kingdom, although there could be evidence that it went back earlier than that. But then over a period of time, over 1,000 years, they were developing and adding to and building this incredible temple. And the slide on the right, I began to start to show some of the alignments on the temple. And someone was talking about the significance of from my point of view, about the alignment to the sun and the moon. Although the sun is predominant in Egypt, there's also evidence that there were certain alignments to what was called lunar standstills. Because again, it's fascinating looking how the sun moves. The sun moves in a fairly regular step-by-step way. I mean, at this time of year, it's speeding up. So if we were to look at the horizon every day, we would see the sun moving quite in a quite evidential way. But once we get through to the solstices, and solstice means stand still, we get 5 days where the sun doesn't really move. You can't detect the movement of it. So both at the winter and the summer, we get this standstill effect occurring. And that again is interesting because it gives you 5 days at any solstice to get the whole sense of seeing what that solstice experience is. So don't get put off if you can't see the sun come up on the 21st of December or the 21st of June. You could always wait till the next day where hopefully the sun will come out and you will get something of the same event. But yes, I started to sort of, I thought, have to go to Egypt now at the time of the winter solstice. So this was the start of this experience. And as you can see here with these two slides, we got fairly early to the temple. You can get in at 6 o'clock, sunrise about 6:30 or something like that. Very few people there. And you can begin to explore this. So when I first went with my wife, we were, wow, this is amazing. And it was just incredible. You get this sense of the alignment of sun going here. And again, you can see in this particular slide, very few people there. And I can recall at one point, this magic moment of the sun coming up and shining right through the temple. And there's one of the Egyptian guides talking about some scene, completely oblivious of what's going on. And there's one or two people at the back of this of his group was sort of looking around and sort of looking, why is this sun coming up here? But I'll show you a few other sort of slides. This is from the sanctuary, the inner sanctuary. Now you see practically no one is there. And you get this blazing light coming through. And this is what's interesting in the Karnak temple is that the inner sanctuary is in the middle of the temple, and it's got doors on both sides of it. So when it's got doors on it, it's obvious at certain points there's both sets of doors would open. Whereas most of the other temples, you go into the temple and the sanctuary is right at the end, and there's no sense of light coming through. But you can see this amazing sense of light coming through in this way. And again, a few others. This is taken from within there, seeing the sun shining through. And the one on the right, this temple at the end, you can see it's just an amazing blaze of light coming through. It was interesting, for various reasons, COVID and one or two things of that nature, was that for quite some years, I made these discoveries back in 2008. I let the Egyptian authorities know. I had to work with them. We got certain permissions, which allowed us to begin to go into places which you couldn't normally get access into. So I was fortunate from that perspective. And I've also been into a few places which I wasn't supposed to go, but managed to get into with a bit of backsheesh, which is the usual way to do it all. But I took a group to Egypt again last December, and I said to the guide, "Oh, we're going to the we need to get into their temple early and so forth." He said, "Well, you have to get there really early and what have you." And I was absolutely blown away, because when we went to the midwinter solstice into the temple, there were thousands of people there. They'd literally, the word had got out somewhere, maybe through Egyptian promotion and so forth, that they then started to recognize this was something important. And so it was packed out. I was fortunate with the guides, which I had, was able to get to the place with the group which we had. So we were able to witness the that solstice moment in a really profound way. But there was another temple which I also made some discoveries on. This is Queen Hatshepsut's famous mortuary temple at a place called Deir el-Bahari. And again, it was on this same midwinter sunrise alignment. And you can imagine, I've done all these calculations, and we were sort of thinking, oh, is it actually going to happen? I managed to get a small group of us together. We got special permission to go inside this chamber, and you're sat there waiting, watching the horizon, waiting at any moment, is the sun going to come up? And it's absolutely magical moments. And the moment that it first appeared, right framed in the doorway of the inner chamber, was just extraordinary. So that was one of the very powerful moments. Let's just go back here, and you can see two other things. So you can see the light comes right into the inner chamber. And then we made some other really extraordinary discoveries, that this temple was very sophisticatedly set up, because there's here in the wall, there was a sort of light box. If I can show it here, just at this point, there's two light boxes, a little bit like Newgrange in Ireland. The sun comes in, shines through the light box, goes right into the inner chamber. Well, the direct light comes in through the main entrance, but there's another light box up here, which shines through, and it creates a difference of angle in relationship to the sun. So there was something very significant about the moment of the midwinter solstice. There's 5 days which occurred, but also a period of about a month later was another alignment which allowed the sun to shine right through this light box into the back. So coming from here on this alignment in to the back. But this is some of the pictures, if you like, from that first time which we went there. You can see this amazing orange light that the sun creates as it comes in, and then it starts to brighten up. And in this slide, you can also see a little bit later, as we've gone through, this light box effect. And it, first of all, it hits the right in the center here is the god Ammon, and then slowly moves down, and this figure here was the Queen Hatshepsut receiving, or the pharaoh receiving that light as illumination as it moved down. But you can see here also in the middle, there is this light box effect. And so at a certain point, about a month later, the light goes right the way through into that inner chamber again, indicating a very special moment. So that experience clearly was woven into Egyptian culture. And if you get a chance to go to Egypt at that time, you can go there exactly the same time as you can in Stonehenge or Avebury, because Avebury's got an alignment to the midwinter sun. If you wish to go and stand at the western entrance of the Henge at midwinter and watch the sun come up, it follows exactly the line of the avenue, the whole series of stones which pick that up. So that was certainly woven into the Avebury Henge monument as well. But remember, don't get put off if you think I'm going to have to deal with all these crowds, because there are 5 days when you can go and witness this event. And last December when we went, I went the next day up to Hatshepsut's temple because obviously I couldn't do the 2 sunrises at the same time. And instead of there being thousands there, which I thought there might be, it was practically empty. So we just had another amazing opportunity. You got a beautiful sunrise coming in. Sometimes you've got to see the balloons flying there. Think, oh, they're going to block out the sun, but they didn't. So it's just an extraordinary place. And again, when we first went, you couldn't go into these inner chambers. They were all blocked off, but we were able to get in, and you can get into them now. Don't know how I'm doing for time. Yes. Okay. So maybe I thought I'd come on to start to talk a little bit about pyramids and something about the creation of the pyramids. And I know there's been quite a bit that's come out recently about the idea there's underground chambers under the pyramids, and I think that's all of that is fascinating. There's tales talk about, A.P. Casey's talked about chambers under the Sphinx and so forth. So I think there's quite a tenable idea. But to come up with a way of being able to access into it, again, is something which I think we're going to have to wait in time, because the Egyptian authorities are very, very wary of allowing excavations to take place unless it's strictly under their control. And the other thing, again, with Egypt, when we first went, we could carry out sort of meditations. You could stand in a group and you could begin to tune into the energies. This last year when we went, we were hustled on. You know, they did not want any form of ceremonies. And at one level, I can understand that, because it could become overwhelming. But from another point of view, from the sense of being able to come together as a group and experience these things in a group way, is a problem in some ways. But the Egyptians were also had a lot of awareness in relationship to certain significant patterns of energy, and they created their pyramids. The Great Pyramid is based upon a height to base ratio. Base ratio, you've got 440 over 280 cubits in height, 440 cubits in a section across it. And what's significant about the Great Pyramid is you've got chambers within the pyramid itself, where most of all the other pyramids, you have the chambers which are underground. A little bit, there is a chamber underground under the Great Pyramid, but in the Great Pyramid's point of view, you've got chambers within the body of the pyramid. So how do they set these pyramids out? Well, they use something called a seked, and it's a very, very simple principle. It's a height to base ratio. So one of these simple sekeds which they used in ancient Egypt, again, which is sometimes claimed that they never knew, was the famous Pythagoras 3-4-5 triangle. So if you have a triangle which is 4 units high by 3 units across, you know the hypotenuse or the side of the triangle is going to be 5 units. So you've got this 3-4-5 ratio. And a number of the pyramids in ancient Egypt were based upon that, including the second of the great pyramids on the Giza Plateau, called the Pyramid of King Khafre. So it's based upon a 3-4-5 triangle. Absolutely. And there's several pyramids built on that. There's over 130 pyramids built in Egypt, most of them in the Old Kingdom. There was a sequence of building which started with that famous step pyramid, and then in a very short period of time moved up to the extraordinary building of the Great Pyramid and the other pyramids on the Giza Plateau. But in this setting out of these simple height to base ratios, again, it's fascinating because when you look at the what's called the metrology of a culture like Egypt, where they're talking about ratios, what you find is that they talk about their units. First of all, you had a digit, which is based upon a finger, and then you had a hand, and then you had what's called the cubit. And the cubit was supposedly the distance between the fingertip and your elbow. And the Egyptians divided that cubit into 7 hands. And just think about that. Why on earth would they want to divide it into 7? You might say, well, that's maybe how it works out naturally. But 7 is an incredibly awkward number. I mean, metric is fine because you can divide things into tens. Our old imperial system was not bad because you had inches and feet and yards, and there was nice precise ratios. 12 inches in a foot, 12, you can divide it in halves, you can divide it in thirds, you can quarter it and so forth. So nice, simple ratios, but 7, why 7? Well, there's only one reason why they would use 7, is if we're to do with circles. Because if you remember back in your school days, certainly I was taught, but maybe you weren't taught it. But the ratio of pi for working out the circumference of the circle was always 22/7. 22/7. 22 is a significant number. So the Egyptians had something similar. They worked out on a cubit, which was 7, and then they could work out the number of palms and digits, which then would set the angle of the pyramid. So if you had a ratio, as we've shown here, of 5 palms to 1 digit, that was a 3-4-5 triangle. And that was exactly the relationship of the Khafre's pyramid. But then if we start to look at this from another perspective, you get the Great Pyramid. And the Great Pyramid is based upon a ratio of 7:11. 7:11. And 7:11 is important because what it was actually telling us, the distance around the pyramid would be the same as if you took the height to the base as the radius of a circle. So if you imagine the height to base as the radius of a circle, that symbolic circle was also measured out in the distance all the way around the pyramid. And where this has resonance back into to what's going on in this area was back in the 1970s. I was fascinated with alignments. So my background was at that time was in town planning and architecture. I had a big drawing board and I had to have all these maps on, and I would get out these maps and I would get out my ruler and I would start to draw lines. Oh, I can see all these points, standing stones and crossroads and churches. You start to draw lines all over the place. I focused particularly on the area up in the Cotswolds because I was living in Cheltenham at the time. And I started to have maps which became obliterated with lines going all over the place. And I started to think, I can't really make too much sense of this. But I started to then go and visit sites. And what was significant from my point of view was what was I feeling when I went to a place where there seemed to be a lot of crossing of these lines. And I started to listen to what I was feeling. I was also working with some other individuals who was all into the weird and the wonderful. So it wasn't just what I was picking up, it was what they were picking up as well. And we started to realize that there were certain places that had real power, there was real energy you felt in them at these crossing points. And so I started to draw rings around these places where I thought were special. And slowly I began to build up a picture. And I began to recognize that certain places seemed to be placed about 6 miles apart. 6 miles became something of a standard. And I started to see how there was certain triangles could be made between these patterns in the Cotswolds. And part of my guidance was at the time in sort of working with these spiritual principles was I needed to begin to look in a much wider way than just focusing in on the Cotswolds, which really for the rest of up until today I've still been doing, still been exploring. But I was looking one day at Avebury. Avebury's just an amazing place, isn't it? And I was looking at the churches, of which this church next to us is one. And I was trying to draw straight lines. You know, can I get any straight lines around it? And the more I kept looking at these churches, I thought, they look as though they're on the circumference of a circle. Oh, that's odd. And I then thought, well, I've got my tracing paper, so I could easily draw a big circle on it, put the map on the drawing board, put the circle on. I thought, well, what radius shall I use? Oh, 6 miles. So I drew a 6 mile radius circle because it looked about right, plonked it on. And not only did I find that this church and the series of other churches going up here, Broadhinton, up to Wroughton and so forth, were all on the circle, went through the Avebury Henge, it goes through the East Kennet Long Barrow, it went through a whole series of other sites, creating a vast landscape circle. So you can imagine, I thought, wow, you know, I mean, and I've done quite a bit of research in this. Setting out straight lines across the landscape is dead easy. People in the past could have set out alignments across long distances, across long distances with considerable ease. Quite easy to do with sighting stars, using alignments to the tops of hills and all of these sorts of things. But to set out a circle in the landscape or to create a circle with a series of points on it, that takes some experience of working with geometry. And the only way you could do it is if you start to work with this concept of a height to base ratio, what's called tangents, really. So you can set out triangles, right angled triangles with height to base ratios, certain ratios, and you get certain angles which are created from them. And in my excitement of, and this was said, it was going back to the 1970s, of seeing this circle, I then started to look, are there any other circles which could come out? And you move the tracing paper around, and eventually I hit upon another circle. I thought, wow, that's that's exciting. So we've got 2 circles. The only problem was the centers of one circle wasn't on the circumference of the other, because part of what I believed was it should create a true vesica, but it didn't. And that sort of frustrated me quite a lot for a period of time. But what I found is when I linked the centers of the 2 circles together, and then I drew on this famous alignment, first presented to us by someone called John Michel in his wonderful book, View Over Atlantis, which my edition, which I've still got from back in the 60s, is well thumbed, absolute mine of information in it. But he talked about the Michael alignment coming from the St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall, going through various sites, the Herder's Stone Circle, going through Glastonbury Tor, and on through Avebury and on to Bury Edmonds and beyond. So when I plotted that on, I found that line was parallel to the 2 circles. So again, had to be more than a coincidence, surely, that these two twin circles. I've eventually, all of this got written up in a book of mine called Keys to the Temple, which was published in the 1990s, quite some period of time after the original discovery. But this is the pattern which emerged. And again, I haven't talked about this much for a long period of time. But if you look at this circle, here you can see the point of the Avebury Henge up here. Here we are, and we're here in Winterbourne Monkton Church. We've got Berwick Bassett, Winterbourne Bassett, Broadhinton, and Wroughton Church, all of that. And then there was not so much on the eastern side, but various other points which went around the circumference of this circle. What I was then amazed at is when I put the cross section, I had an insight that perhaps I needed to create an equilateral triangle between the points here and another point up there. And then when I created that point and then put a line back to here, I found I got an exact reference to the cross section of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. So that's on a 14:11 ratio. And lo and behold, right in the middle here, where the King's Chamber would be, on the ground is a place called Temple Farm, named after the Knights Templars. So I would like you to think that where we are here is where this alignment, the circumference of the circle goes right through the middle of this room. But if we go right across the other side of it on a diameter, we would be 12 miles distance. But there's something magical which was woven into this landscape by the people back around about 2800 BC. Because another way of setting out alignments in the landscape is using stars to set these alignments out. And one of the significant star groupings, which was well known in ancient Egypt, was the star grouping of Orion, what we know today as Orion, called Sahu-Re in ancient Egypt. And if you look at the belt of Orion, around 2800 BC, you find it absolutely aligns up with this Michael line. So 2800 BC, thereabouts, I could be stood on top of a hill, watch for the setting of the stars of Orion, and begin to plot a line across the country, which is what I think was done then. And from that, in my book, it's available. You can get it on a secondhand book. It's not available in print at the moment. You get secondhand copies of it. I know that's available. So be aware that if you like, when we go into Avery, when you go into areas like this, you're in a magical landscape. There is all sorts of different levels of energy that you can begin to connect to. And there's something profound, which I think links into this pattern and also to the pyramid sites in Egypt, on the Giza Plateau particularly. So again, this just shows the link. Where we are at this moment in time is here. And as far as I can see, the line goes through the center there. So we're right on it. You picked a brilliant place, Maria. But the church, you can see why the church is special as well. Because from my point of view, each of these churches would have had to be marked out by some other ancient sacred site there before them. So whether it was a stone circle, whether it was some other monument at all, which was on that point, they would all have had to be part of it. So it's beginning to just recognize the level of the landscape, that not all of the patterns which are set out here, and with Google Earth, I've been able to get patterns which look at the whole, predominantly the major alignments which run through this country. The whole of the British Isles is connected into a whole pattern of network. Maybe some areas are not quite so heavily evidenced in others, but there's key places. There's another well-known alignment which starts in Canterbury, goes right across the country, goes to a monument called Abbey Door, but it goes through some key places as well, go right through the middle of London. So there are these major alignments which is here in the British Isles. And if you begin to link up some of these places, you can begin to see why there's a significance between Glastonbury and Canterbury Abbey. Canterbury Abbey is not the cathedral. Don't worry about the cathedral. If you go to Canterbury, go to the Abbey. That's the place where the energy is. Okay. I think probably I've said enough. I've got a few minutes left. I've shown this up. I've got my books here in relationship to working with earth energies, and also my book on illuminating the shadows. But the other thing I would like to put out a question to you: have any of you here had a hypnotic regression session? Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, what I would like you to do, I'm doing research at the moment through the University of Liverpool, John Moores University, in relationship to studying hypnotic regression, because it's a whole area which is really important. And I need some people who would be willing to fill in a questionnaire, short online questionnaire. So if those of you are willing, can come and see me either in the next tea break. But I've got a very simple QR code here, which you can use your phone on, and it will take you through to the first of all, to the question. Well, first of all, to a sort of form for consent form, which we have to get nowadays, but also then take you through to the questionnaire. Take only about 5 minutes to fill in, but I'm looking for your experiences really in relationship to the regression session that you are doing. So at that point, I think I've said enough, and hand you back to Maria.
Wow, David Furlong. David, that was fantastic. I love David's work and the keys to the temple. What I find is so beautiful here. I doused that with my dad because of David Furlong. And so that was a wonderful thing. So I've been working with those churches for about 20 years now, or longer if it's 1990. Geez. Okay, then. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a break, okay? About half an hour break, and then we'll be talking as the last speaker, and then I'm going to host Q&A with the speakers. So if there's anything, start having a think now about the type of questions you want to ask the speakers, and I can come along and you can shout at them, because I'm sure you've got loads of things to ask after these fantastic presentations. So one more round for the one and only David Furlong.